so we kind of have a place where we're going, kind of know where we're at. He went to Annas and Caiaphas first, and we talked about that they were both in the New Testament at different times named high priest and kind of how that worked since there's only be one high priest. It was after that that he that Peter denied him the first time. Peter made that denial. And then once again, he's going to be before the council, the Jewish council. And we talked about that last week. We talked about him being mocked. We talked about Peter's denial, just kind of reviewing where we're at this morning. And then he's going to go before Pilate. This is more the formal trial. This is what they have to do in order to have him crucified. They got to get him before Pilate into Pilate's hall, the Praetorium. They call that. The Jews wouldn't enter because it was close to the Sabbath, and they didn't want to be unclean. So he was going back and forth. We talked a little bit about Judas, his suicide early on here, and that was kind of tragic, very tragic that he didn't. It would have been nice if Judas could have saw how this all played out, I think, but unfortunately that wasn't the case. Judas was unable to live with his guilt and his remorse. He committed suicide. And then to Pilate we go. Must have been quite a crowd, right? Accused him of forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar and saying that he himself is Christ, a king. So Pilate is the governor of Judea, the proconsul of Judea. He's the one who has that authority, governing authority. You might call him a governor, maybe would be more our terminology. But he had the Roman authority to do this in Judea. In order to put Christ to death, they would have to get Pilate to do that, to put him to death. Now, we know Stephen was stoned not long after, a few years after this, and they drug Stephen out and they stoned him. And the Romans let the Jews get away with a lot of things, okay, because they didn't want to make them mad. So they let them get away with a lot. But to actually, and I don't know if you've ever really considered this or not, but it's kind of an interesting idea that Stephen was stoned, right? And you can kind of see him getting away with that, right? I mean, they just drug him out somewhere and stoned him, right? And I mean, you can kind of see getting away with that kind of thing. I mean, the Romans they didn't really want to make the Jews mad. That was something that could be done kind of under the radar, so to speak. Wasn't a big public thing necessarily. It was kind of done amongst themselves. They took Stephen, they drug him out somewhere outside of the city and stoned him to death. But Jesus couldn't die that way, could he? I mean, Jesus couldn't be stoned, right? Jesus had to be crucified. I mean, that was what had to happen. That was prophetic. He had to be, and Jesus even said in John, he said, if I'm lifted up, I'll draw them into myself. He had to be crucified. And crucifixion was something that the Jews couldn't pull off because that's really, really a public thing. That was a Roman thing. That wasn't a Jewish thing. Jews didn't crucify people. That was never how Jews in the law. That was never how you killed people under Judaism. You killed them by stoning them to death. That's how it was done. I mean, that's what God put down in the law. Crucifixion wasn't a Jewish death. Crucifixion was a Roman death. And Jesus had to die a Roman death. And in order for that to happen, he had to go be convicted by the Romans, not by the Jews. Paul used it to his advantage, didn't he, when they tried to beat him? Remember that? And Paul said, I'm a Roman citizen. And they wouldn't do it, right? Matter of fact, the guard that was over him, or the centurion of that guard, was scared, wasn't he? Because he almost beat a Roman. That could have been really, really bad. So there was law here, and to an extent, and this had to happen under this Roman death, under this Roman way, in order for prophecy to be fulfilled. In order for Jesus to be crucified, this had to happen this way. Crucifixion wasn't an ancient death, and I think I've brought that up before, but You know, even in the Old Testament, when it talked about hanging someone on a tree or impaling someone or hanging someone on a gallows in the Old Testament, whether we're talking about Esther or Naaman, or even go back before that, you know, talking about David in the times of David, when they were hung, they were impaled upon a stake and stuck in the ground. They were just stuck on a stake. They weren't. Crucifixion was Roman. It was fairly modern way to kill someone, to crucify someone was a fairly modern way to do it. So this was very unique, but very, very popular, very, very much used at the time of Jesus. Matter of fact, historically, we know there was one time they crucified like 3,000 people at one time. So crucifixion was not unique. I mean, at this time, it was something that was widely used by the Romans. And the Romans would crucify people, and they would, if you were a Roman citizen, they would, sometimes you get beheaded. That was a little bit better, right? You get beheaded as opposed to, if you know Peter and Paul, they were both executed by Nero in Rome, right? Peter was crucified, Paul was beheaded. And that's because Peter wasn't Roman. He was Galilean. Peter was crucified because that was a more torturous death. Paul, on the other hand, was a Roman citizen, so Paul got beheaded. That's why they were executed differently under the same emperor. So they were good at killing people, obviously. Pilate wanted Jesus to defend himself, and really this comes right out of Isaiah 53, where he says, the lamb before his shears was silent, so he did not open his mouth. Jesus made very little defense, actually almost no defense on his behalf. Pilate, of course, wanted to set him free. I find no guilt. Jesus made no answer. Pilate was amazed, Mark says. In Luke, though, he says, Pilate heard it. He asked whether the man was a Galilean. And Luke's what gives us this. Luke gives us so much, sometimes better historical background than everybody else. Because of this, we're going to go to Herod. This is where we bring Herod into this, because this is Herod Antipas, okay? And Herod, when Herod the Great died, there were 3 of his children who took over his regions, okay? Herod Antipas was one of those. Philip and one other Herod. My mind's not working yet this morning. It'll get there in a minute. Anyway, but the one who was over Judea, the sibling that was over Judea, I think that might have been Philip. The sibling that was over Judea, he only lasted about 3 or 4 months and got disposed from office. And when that happened, you got to remember, kings were kings because the emperor wanted them, give them that title, so that could be taken away. And when that was taken away, a lot of times, instead of what we would say another king would be set, because really they weren't really kings like we think kings. They were king by title, you know. Instead of them putting another quote, quote, king in place, they would put a governor in place, which was Pilate. But Herod Antipas, he stayed in power for a while, but he wasn't over Judea, because Herod the Great's territory was fairly large, like all of what we would consider, if you've ever really seen a map of everything that the Jews took over, plus a little more down south, that was kind of Herod's territory. And Herod had a pretty large territory. So Herod Antipas, though, is the one that stayed in power the longest, and he was over that southern part. So he was over Galilee. So because Jesus was Galilean, he was actually not under Pontius Pilate's jurisdiction, because he was over Judea. So he said, all right, I'll get this monkey off my back. I'll send him to Herod. So that's what he did. And Herod wanted to see Jesus because, and here I pulled John in a little bit, and I looked at this last week. The Jews wouldn't put it says the Jews were not permitted to put anyone to death. This fulfilled the word which he spoke, what kind of death he was about to die. Pilate entered again, tore him, summoned Jesus, said, are you king of the Jews? And Jesus answered, did you say so on initiative, or did others tell you about me? He says, I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation, the chief priest, delivered you to me. What have you done? And Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would be fighting so that it would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm. And Pilate said, so you are a king? And Jesus answered, you say correctly that I am a king. For this I have been born, for this I have come into this world to testify to the truth. Everyone who's of the truth hears my voice. And Pilate says to him, what is truth? And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said, I find no guilt in him. And then he's going to send him to Herod. And Luke's who gives us Herod. Herod was excited to see him because he wanted to see a miracle. He wanted to see Jesus do something, perform a sign. He questioned him, but Jesus answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes were standing there accusing him vehemently. And Herod with the soldiers, after treating him with contempt and mocking him, dressed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him back to Pilate. Now Herod and Pilate became friends with one another at that very day, for before that they had been enemies with each other. I don't know why we have that tidbit of information. Pilate's not going to stay in power long after Jesus is crucified. I think less than 2 years. Pilate will be disposed. He's going to wind up getting killed. So Pilate doesn't have long left. Somebody else is going to take his place, as often happened in this society, and in all societies, I guess. So Herod has to be pulled in because Herod is actually over at Galilee, but Jesus, of course, doesn't defend himself. Herod's where he gets the robe, puts him in a robe, sends him back to Pilate, because technically he's still in Pilate's jurisdiction. Pilate's part of the world. So Herod basically was a no-show, no-brainer thing. So we're going to bring him back. Luke says we bring him back to Pilate. And he brings them all together. And he says, I found no guilt, nor has Herod, for he sent him back to us. Behold, nothing deserving death has been done. Therefore I will punish him and release him. So this is how we get our scourging, right? It says he will be scourged in the Old Testament. So we're going to scourge him. This was Pilate's way of trying to get out of this. I'm going to punish him. I'm going to scourge him. It was terrible. I can't imagine. I seen Passion of the Christ one time. If that's accurate, it's really, really bad. Might have been worse than that. But it was a terrible thing to be scourged with these whips that had these things tied into them. So this has been going on a while by now, right? I don't know if you could put yourself in the place of Christ. I think that's hard to do, but just the very fact that he had had no sleep. This had been going on now for hours, right? He's been before Caiaphas. He's been before Annas. He's been before Pilate. He's been before Herod. He's back at Pilate. He's been beaten. He's been spit upon. He's had a crown of thorns put on his head. He's had a robe placed upon him. Now he's back before Pilate again. Pilate's wanting to release him. This is pretty enduring. This is pretty grueling, isn't it? This is a pretty grueling event. Barabbas is apparently a murderer, committed murder in the insurrection, Mark tells us. And that was probably one of the Jewish uprisings that occurred every so often here as the Jews tried to get rid of Rome, or that's what most scholars believe it is. And he had been condemned. So they're going to release one, right? So he holds up the worst one. So Jesus is going to be held, and the worst prisoner that he has is going to be released. He's been traded for the worst of the worst. Pilate answered him, do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews? For he was aware the chief priests had handed him over because of envy. Do you want me to release Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ? For he knew because of envy. While he was sitting on his judgment seat, his wife sent him a message saying, I have nothing to do with that righteous man. For last night I suffered greatly in a dream because of him. So Pilate's wife had a dream. She says, don't have anything to do with it. With this righteous man, she calls him a righteous man. But they wouldn't have anything of it, would they? Once again, this is a Jewish town. Pilate knows that if he incites these Jews, there'll be a riot. Things are going to go bad. He's in a tough place, isn't he? Away with this man, released for us Barabbas. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again, but they kept calling out, "Crucify, crucify him." What evil has this man done? I found no guilt. Therefore I will punish him and release him. What shall I do with whom you call King of the Jews? They shouted about, "Crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" Pilate could have released him, but he couldn't, could he? I mean, this is a bad deal. Pilate should have released him. Everything says, yeah, should have let him go. But you got this riot outside. Pilate's wanting to appease the Jews. So they're going to scourge him, right? They dressed him in the purple, twisting a crown of thorns, acclaiming hell, kept beating him in the head with a reed, spitting on him, kneeling and bowing. This is about as bad as it gets. Jesus had a tremendous amount of self-restraint, didn't he? I mean, he had the power to end all this right here, right now, But he didn't. He knew he had to do this. This was the cup that he wanted to pass from him, but he knew he had to endure it. I brought John in again because I think you have to look at John a little bit here. Pilate came out again. "Behold, I'm bringing him out to you. I have found no guilt." Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns, a purple robe. Pilate said, "Behold the man." He brought him out because he wanted them to see how beaten up he was. He wanted to maybe have some compassion, right? Bring this guy out that had been scourged, that had been beaten, blood running down him. And he thought, well, why did he bring him back out? He said, well, maybe they'll have some compassion. They'll see how bad it is, how bad he's beaten up, and they'll say, oh, maybe they'll relent. But they didn't relent, did they? They were bloodthirsty. They was pushing it. He says, take him yourselves and crucify him. And Pilate says, we have a law, but that law ought to die. But the law not to die this way. When the Pilate heard this statement, he was more afraid. He entered the praetorium. He said, where are you from? But Jesus gave no answer. So Pilate said to him, you do not speak to me? Do you not know I have authority to release you? And I have authority to crucify you. And Jesus answered, you have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin. So who's at fault for crucifying Jesus? Yeah, the Jews are, right? I don't think you should say that. I don't think you should say that all inclusively. I mean, these Jews, right? They're the ones who did it. These chief priests, these scribes, these Jews that did that. The Jews cried out, if you release this man, you're no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes us out to be a king opposes Caesar. He brought Jesus out, sat down in the judgment seat. It was a day of preparation before the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, behold your king. So they cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? And the chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. So, they're pushing for this. Pilate's not going to stand up. They kept shouting the more, crucify him. They were insistent with loud voices. Their voices began to prevail, Luke says. So he did what had to be done, I guess, according to prophecy. Everything we read it, we think, well, they should have just let him go. That would be the thing. But that couldn't happen. You have to keep that in mind as we go through this. That couldn't happen. So he released Barabbas, and he had Jesus scourged, and he handed him over to be crucified. In Matthew 26, Matthew 27:26, and Mark 15:15, the scourging is referred to that already is inflicted and recorded in John 19:1. So really don't think he was scourged twice, in other words. Just because that would all, well, really I don't think according to the law they even could have actually done that. So it's the same scourging. So it's just, I don't know why some gospel, it has to do with just how they arrange. I think it has to do with kind of where they want the emphasis to lie, when they're writing. In the Gospels, sometimes that's what you see. That's why I kind of wanted to put these up side by side, because sometimes they shift stuff. Sometimes chronological order isn't as important to them as it is to me and you. So sometimes, like you see a scourging in John, and this is the same scourging, but this scourging had already occurred, I think, by the time this happened. And I think that was always kind of confusing to me, because I'm like, well, they wanted to let him go, and then he takes them, and right before he releases them, he scourges them again, and then he releases them. But I really don't think that was how it was played out. I think the scourging was earlier, and it's just how they placed it when they wrote it. So by this time, it's the 6th hour. What time of day is that? Right, 3rd, 6th, and 9th, right? 6th is about noon, so it's about noon, 6th hour of the day. So it's, we got to have time to get him to the cross, right, before dark. So he says, we're going to deliver him to your will. So let's kind of lay this out, okay? Pilate condemns Jesus to die. Now this is Catholic. No, let me back up a minute. Hold on. So there's two different. I think it's kind of I kind of raised Catholic. So in the Catholic, there's 14 stations of the cross. Okay, and if you ever go into a Catholic, if you go into somebody help me out. Well, not mass, but no, not a a church, a Catholic church, I'll say, but yeah, there we go. A cathedral, that's the word I'm looking for. If you go into a cathedral and you ever go in to look at one, or you go to Europe, or even around here, if you go into one, and if you have a chance to look, if you go around the outside of the auditorium, or the sanctuary they would call it, and you'll see these stations of the cross, 14 stations of the cross. And they're generally on the walls, and you'll see little things, and you can just kind of go around, and there's 14 stations of the cross. So, and they're not all, I would say, biblical idea, and there's two different kind of deals of this. The first one's Pilate condemns Jesus to die. Jesus accepts his cross. Jesus falls for the first time. That's an interesting thing, Jesus falling. The Bible never says he fell. I don't know if you know that or not. That's one of those things that we've heard our whole lives, and we've always heard that. And I'm not saying that he didn't. I think that could be realistic, that he fell. But the Bible never says that he fell. And I don't know if you've ever really noticed that or not. It never says that he fell. It just says that they compelled Simon the Cyrene to carry the cross. It said he was unable to carry it. But it never says that he fell. I don't know if that's significant or not. I just think it's interesting, that we hear that so much. And that's another way. And one reason I brought this up, because I've always said, art influences our faith sometimes. And most religious art is Renaissance art. It's not Jewish art, it's English, it's Renaissance, and that's what influenced. You see these great paintings, and even in St. Peter's Basilica and then places, that was people like Michelangelo and people like that did that centuries after Christ. So that's how come our picture of Jesus is really European. We have a European Christ, don't we? We don't have a Middle Eastern Christ. We have a European Christ, because art influences. And when we picture, I know I do, because all my life when I picture in my mind, you all know what Jesus looks like, right? In your mind, right? We don't know, but I'm just telling you, every one of you in here, if I say Jesus, there's a picture in your mind. You got a picture in your mind, right? And that picture is because of art, because of our art influences. We don't know what Jesus looked like. Isaiah says that Jesus was nothing to behold, right? Nothing to behold. He was not a good-looking guy by no stretch of the imagination. Yet we have this beautiful European Christ hanging on the cross, right? That's not realistic. But anyway, it's kind of interesting how we're influenced by that. Jesus meets his mother Mary. Simon helps carry the cross. Veronica, in Catholicism, one of the women who follow Jesus, wipes the face of Jesus. Jesus falls for the second time. Jesus meets the woman of Jerusalem, falls for the third time, stripped of his clothes, nailed to the cross, dies on the cross, taken down from the cross, placed in the tomb. So there's another 14 stations, a little bit different than that. Garden of Gethsemane, betrayed, condemned, denied, judged, scourged, takes up his cross. Simon of Cyrene meets the woman of Jerusalem, crucified, promises his kingdom to the repentant thief, entrusts Mary and John to each other, dies on the cross, laid in a tomb. But anyway, just throwing that out there. But if you ever happen to go into a cathedral and you have time and you go, you'll see these on the sides of the cathedral as you walk your way around, the 14 stations of the cross. Catholics call that in Latin, right? It's the Via Dolorosa, right? Way of the cross. A lot of stuff goes with this. These are the pictures, some pictures you would see in a cathedral. Jesus falling under the cross, under the weight of the cross. That's what you'll see if you go around. These illustrations usually, sometimes they're like sculptures or sometimes they're paintings, but it's just interesting to me. Interesting. If you ever happen to do that, it's quite interesting. The little halos on their heads, we know they're right. Art really influences pictures. We're very visual people, right? Art has a lot of influence on us, how we see things. So Jesus is mocked. They mocked him, took the purple robe off him, put on his own garments, which had to happen, right? All this stuff had to happen because they're going to cast lots for his robe. Right? So his robe, that would be his outer garment, his cloak, his outer robe. So it has to go with him to the cross. Our prophecy couldn't be fulfilled. Everything here has to happen. Everything has to happen in a certain way. They pressed into his service, they passed her by. Like I said, never says Jesus fell. In 14 stations of the cross, it has him fallen 3 different times. Bible never says that he fell to the ground ever. And I actually heard a preacher preach a whole sermon on that one time, and he was really animate about it, that Jesus never fell. I don't know that it matters that much to me one way or another. I mean, I think he could have fallen for sure. Just isn't in the text. It's Simon of Cyrene to bear his cross, and so he's the one that would carry his cross. Why they picked him particularly, I don't know. I don't know. He was there. Maybe he was a strapping, strong lad. I don't know why they picked him. But he carried the cross. And according to what I understand, that's just the top beam. It's not the whole cross. So apparently they didn't carry the piece that was the piece that actually went into the ground. The way I understand this, historically, they didn't carry that piece. They carried the piece that was the crossbar is what apparently, what I understand, that's what you actually carried. So that he didn't carry like the whole cross. It was just the beam that would hold his hands, the top beam. That's what I understand. Historically, that's all they actually carried. It's kind of like picking out your own switch to get whipped with and use a kid, but you had to carry your own cross kind of deal. So, but that's apparently what it was. There was a large crowd of people, the women especially, mourning and lamenting. I love that word, lamenting. I don't really understand it all the way. I don't think people lament much anymore. But, you know, that means like lamenting is like real grief. Like, it's like, I don't know how to describe it. But what a powerful word. Weeping. If you'll notice, it says the They're mourning but lamenting. Lamenting is such a powerful word. Jesus turning to them says, daughters of Jerusalem, stop weeping for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. Behold, the days are coming when they will say, blessed are the barren, the wombs that never bore. This is very reminiscent of what he said in Matthew, talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. The breasts that never nursed. They will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, to the hills cover us. For if they do these things and the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry? Two others also who are criminals are being led away to be put to death with him. You know, we often forget those criminals are they're walking the same path, aren't they? I mean, they're doing exactly the same thing Jesus is doing. Like I said, this wasn't a unique way to die by any means. This happened all the time. They brought him to Golgotha. They gave him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not drink. And I think that's important. We don't, so many things, little things in here. I've watched a lot of these History Channel things, maybe you have too, about Jesus and about the crucifixion and about how they said, well, they could have given him a sedative here to like put him into a deep sleep, and he would just like, put him into a coma state. But if you'll notice, the Bible covers so many bases with this. He didn't drink it, right? They give him wine mixed with myrrh, but he didn't drink. Then later on, they're going to give him, a sponge. So it says they crucified two robbers with him, one on his right, one on his left. And of course, that scripture in Mark is Isaiah 53. That's fulfilled by this, that he had to be numbered among the transgressors, Isaiah says, and laid with a rich man in his death, which would have been the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. So much prophecy here that's being fulfilled in a short period of time. We always have Jesus' cross taller in art, right? His is always the tallest cross. I don't think that's probably true. I think they were probably all the same height. I think a cross was a cross. But he was in the middle. The Bible says he was in the middle. One on his right, one on his left, right? All three of these men being crucified at the same time. And then this superscription, which becomes a real problem. In Matthew, it says, above his head they put the charge, this is Jesus, the King of the Jews. And of course, that incited the Jews to wrath, right? They didn't want it to say that at all. John, got to go to John now. Got to go back to John. Can't help it. He put it in three languages, right? Pilate also wrote an inscription, put it on the cross. Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews. Therefore, many of the Jews read this inscription. It was written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. So Hebrew was the language of the temple. Latin was the language of the law. Greek was the language of the people. So Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. The chief priests of the Jews saying to Pilate, do not write the King of the Jews, but he said, I am King of the Jews. And Pilate answered, what I've written, I've written. Then the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, took his outer garments, made four parts, a part to every soldier, and also the tunic. Now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece. And I didn't finish that text, but because of that, then they would cast lots because they didn't want to tear that garment. And that was fulfill the prophecy, right, that his robe would not be torn, that they would cast lots for his garment. So a lot of things going on here, a lot of fulfillment of prophecy going on here. Luke is the only one who gives this saying, and I don't know if you know it or not, but there's a lot of debate about this in Luke. Because, number one, he's the only gospel writer who says that Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Luke also says Luke records Stephen basically saying exactly the same thing in Acts when Stephen's being stoned. He says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing. Some people think that Luke put this in there because he didn't want Stephen to look better than Jesus in this regard. Kind of interesting. I'm just throwing this stuff out here. It doesn't mean I believe it. Just giving you some what scholars debate about, spend all their days doing. But Luke's the only one who records it, but that's not surprising to me because Luke's a lot more inclusive with things than the other gospel writers are. So Jesus has these sayings from the cross. These sayings from the cross, and this is where this begins, the first one that we see begin. And then they delivered him. They divided up his garments, casting lots, to decide which each man should take. They casting lots, sitting down, and began to keep watch over him. The soldiers, when they crucified Jesus, took his outer garments, made 4 parts, a part to every soldier. Also the tunic was seamless. Let us not tear it, but cast lots for it to decide whose it shall be. And this is be fulfilled the scripture. They divided my outer garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Comes out of the 22nd Psalm. So, you know, as we get closer, it's just, there's such a body of prophecy that has to be fulfilled here, such a large body of prophecy. And about everything that Jesus is doing, everything that we've gone over this morning and everything that he's doing from this point on is in fulfillment of prophecy. So it's amazing how this happened. I know we've seen this a lot. If you're a Christian, you've been over this a lot. You've read it. You've heard people talk about it. But, you know, if you really back up and just think of how all this had to happen to fulfill everything that was written, it's pretty inspiring that this happened the way that it did. And so I hope you kind of start putting that together. It's amazing to me, so much goes on in my mind when I talk about this. Not just historically, I'm thinking historically, but also I'm thinking of how we've been so influenced by what we've heard and read and seen and art and pictures over the years, and trying to discern the truth in all that of how it actually happened, and Jesus fulfilling all this Old Testament prophecy. There's a lot going on right now. So I hope you kind of see that. Thanks for your time this morning.